They said it was a community upgrade, but they built it on the wrong man's land. The smell of chlorine hit me before I even stepped out of my truck, sharp and artificial, cutting through the dry Texas air like it didn't belong here. Because it didn't. Not on soil that had spent 3 generations feeding cattle and holding onto every drop of rain like it mattered. Because out here it always did, and the moment my boots hit the gravel, I heard it. Water sloshing, kids laughing somewhere in the distance. And for a second, just a second, my brain tried to make sense of it like maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, like maybe I wasn't standing on my own property anymore. But then I saw it, crystal blue, perfectly tiled, an infinity pool stretching across the back 40 like a postcard ripped out of some suburban dream. Except this wasn't a dream, and it sure as hell wasn't suburban. This was my ranch, my father's land, the same ground where I learned how to mend fences at 12 and count cattle before sunrise. And now it had lounge chairs on it, white umbrellas, a polished stone deck where my livestock used to graze. I could feel the heat rising off the concrete. They poured like they owned the place, like they had the right. And that's when I noticed the sign, clean lettering bolted into the ground. Willow Creek Estates Private Community Pool. Private. That word sat wrong in my chest, like a bad taste you can't spit out, because nothing about this was private. Not when it was sitting on land deeded to my family since 1968. I walked closer, slow, steady, boots crunching against gravel that hadn't been here a month ago. And the closer I got, the clearer it became. This wasn't some mistake. This was planned, engineered, approved by someone who thought nobody would push back. Someone who saw empty pasture and called it wasted space. And I already knew exactly who that someone was before I even heard her voice, smooth, rehearsed, carrying across the water like she was hosting a grand opening instead of standing on stolen ground. Linda Graves, HOA. President, the kind of woman who smiles like she's doing you a favor while she rewrites your reality. She didn't see me yet, too. Busy giving a tour to a couple in tennis whites, talking about enhancing property values and modern amenities, words that don't belong anywhere near a working ranch. And I just stood there for a moment, letting it sink in, the smell, the sound, the sight of it all, because reacting too fast is how you lose these kinds of fights. And I've learned something over the years, whether it was fixing broken irrigation lines or dealing with county paperwork that never seems to end. You don't win by yelling. You win by knowing exactly what you're standing on. And right then, standing there with chlorine in the air and my land buried under polished concrete, I realized something they hadn't, something they never even thought to check. Because people like Linda don't look for limits. They assume there aren't any. But limits exist, written in ink, buried in records older than her entire neighborhood. And every inch of that pool was sitting right on top of them. I didn't say a word, didn't call anyone, didn't make a scene, because what they didn't know yet was simple. I wasn't here to stop them. I was here to let them finish. I did not walk up to Linda that day, did not raise my voice, did not point at the pool or the sign or the way her guests were stepping barefoot on ground that used to hold my cattle, because I have seen this kind of thing before, not a pool exactly, but people assuming that if something looks unused then it must be available. And out here that kind of thinking gets you into trouble fast. So I turned around, got back in my truck, and let the engine idle for a second while the sound of splashing water faded behind me, mixing with the low hum of cicadas and the distant rattle of wind through dry grass that still belonged to me whether they believed it or not. And as I drove down the long dirt road toward the main gate, I passed the old fence line where my father once showed me how to set posts straight using nothing but a level and patience, and I could almost hear his voice again telling me that land does not lie. People do, paperwork does, but land stays exactly where it has always been, and that thought sat with me all the way into town, where the air shifted from dust and hay to asphalt and hot engine oil, and I parked outside the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and air conditioning that never quite kept up with the Texas heat. Inside it was quiet, the kind of quiet where every footstep echoes just a little too loud, and I nodded to the clerk who barely looked up as I signed in. Because this was not the first time I had come here, not by a long shot, and I already knew where to go, straight to the back where the older records were kept, the ones most people never bother to check because they assume newer documents override everything else. But assumptions are expensive when they are wrong. I pulled the file I was looking for, thick, worn at the edges, the kind of folder that has outlived the people who first signed it. And as I flipped it open, the faint smell of dust and ink hit me. Familiar, steady, grounding. There it was, the original deed. From 1968, my grandfather's signature, clear and deliberate, alongside the survey lines that had not changed in over 50 years, lines that cut right through where that pool now sat. But that was only the beginning, because attached to that deed were water rights, older than the subdivision, older than most of the roads leading to it. Rights that did not just grant ownership of land, but control over how water on that land could be used. And I traced those lines with my finger. Slow, careful, like I was reading a map back to something they never even knew existed. And then I found it, the clause most people would skip right over. A single paragraph about agricultural use, about livestock access, about how any water source located within those boundaries could not legally restrict animals from reaching it. I leaned back in the chair, the metal creaking softly under my weight. And for the first time since I saw that pool, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not frustration, something quieter, something sharper, because Linda Graves had built something beautiful, something expensive, something that looked like power, but she had built it on top of rules she did not understand. And that kind of mistake does not need to be forced into failure. It just needs time. I closed the file, signed the checkout log, and stepped back into the heat, the sun hitting hard enough to make you squint. And as I got into my truck again, I did not feel rushed, did not feel the need to call a lawyer or file a complaint, because this was not a fight I was going to start today. This was a process, and processes, when done right, do not explode, they unfold. And by the time I turned the key and started the engine, I already knew exactly what I was going to do next, not to stop them, not yet, but to make sure that when the time came, everything they built would work exactly the way the law said it should, not the way they wanted it to. I did not go back to the pool the next day or the day after that, not because I was avoiding it, but because timing matters more than presence in situations like this. And instead I went back to the ranch house, the old place sitting a quarter-mile from where the new concrete now shimmered under the sun, and I walked the fence line the way my father used to, slow and deliberate, boots pressing into dry soil that still held the memory of rain from last season. The air carried that familiar mix of dust and grass. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. Except it was not, because just beyond that ridge sat a structure that did not belong. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Linda had not just built something. She had committed to it. Permits, contractors, materials. All of it required time, money, and confidence. The kind of confidence that only comes from believing nobody is going to challenge you. And that belief was about to become her biggest problem. I spent the afternoon making calls, not to lawyers, not yet, but to the agricultural office, to a contact I had not spoken to in years, a man named Carl Benson, who handled livestock registrations for the county. His voice came through the lines steady and familiar, like nothing had changed since the last time we talked about grazing permits and seasonal water access. I kept it simple, told him I needed to update my records, expand my livestock count, and confirm water source accessibility under current agricultural use. There was a pause on the line, papers shuffling, the faint hum of an office printer in the background. And then he said something that locked everything into place. As long as the water source is on your deeded land, access cannot be restricted, not if it is being used for livestock. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for a second, letting that settle in, because that was the line, not a loophole, not a trick, a line written into policy that had been there long before Willow Creek Estates ever existed. And then I drove out to the far pasture where my cattle had been grazing, 30 head, calm, steady, moving through the field like they always had. The sound of hooves pressing into dirt, the low hum of movement that never really stops. I leaned against the fence and watched them for a while, thinking about distance, about gates, about how animals do not question boundaries unless something changes. And something had definitely changed. By the time the sun started to drop, casting long shadows across the land, I had already mapped it out in my head, not just what I could do, but when, because this was not about reacting. This was about alignment, legal, physical, and undeniable. I needed the pool to be finished, fully operational, clearly established as a water feature, not construction, not temporary, permanent, documented, and public. So I waited. Days turned into a week, then two, And each time I passed by the edge of that development, I saw more chairs, more people, more confidence building in a place that did not belong to them. Linda started hosting events, small at first, then larger, the sound of music drifting across the fence line, laughter echoing where cattle used to graze, and still I said nothing, because every splash, every guest, every photograph they posted online was not just a celebration, it was evidence, proof that they had completed exactly what I needed them to. And one evening, just as the sun dipped low enough to turn the water's surface into a sheet of gold, I parked my truck at the edge of the property again, stepped out, and this time I did not stop at the fence. I walked all the way up to the gate they had installed, new metal, polished, locked with a code panel that probably made them feel secure. I ran my hand across it, feeling the cool steel under my fingers, and I smiled. Not because I was angry, not because I was about to start something, but because they had just finished building the most expensive livestock water trough this county had ever seen, and they had done it for me. I let them have their grand opening without interruption, did not step in, did not argue, did not even drive past that ridge for 2 full days. Because anticipation is louder than confrontation when people think they have already won. And by the 3rd afternoon, the entire place was alive with activity. Cars lined along the access road, music drifting across the pasture, the kind of polished, curated noise that does not belong anywhere near open land. And I could hear it from my porch, sitting there with a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand while the sun hung heavy over the horizon, turning everything gold except that patch of blue cutting through it like it had been dropped there from somewhere else. I watched the dust trails rise as more people arrived, each one stepping into a version of reality Linda had carefully constructed, a place where she controlled access, controlled image, controlled narrative, and for a while, it probably felt real to her, probably felt permanent. I finished my drink, set the glass down, and stood up slow, no rush, no urgency, just a quiet shift from waiting to moving. I grabbed the folder from the kitchen table, the same papers I had reviewed the night before, edges straight, nothing out of place, and walked out to the truck, the door creaking open with that familiar sound that never changes no matter how many times you hear it. The engine turned over steady, and I drove toward the pasture again, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. The way you drive when you already know exactly what is about to happen. When I reached the fence line, I parked and stepped out, the air thicker now, carrying the faint scent of chlorine mixed with grilled food and something sweet, probably sunscreen or perfume. It all felt out of place, layered over something older and more honest. I walked to the gate I had reset the day before, rested my hand on the metal for a second, feeling the heat it had absorbed under the sun, and then I pushed it open, smooth, silent, no resistance, just as it was meant to be. Behind me the cattle shifted slightly, subtle at first, a few heads lifting, ears turning, the low sound of movement building as instinct did what it always does. They knew where water was. They always do. I did not call them, did not guide them. I just stepped aside and let the path exist. And within minutes the first few started forward, slow, cautious, hooves pressing into dirt that led straight toward that polished edge of concrete. I walked along the fence line parallel to them, not interfering, just observing as the distance closed. And as they reached the ridge, the sounds from the pool area changed, laughter dipping, voices shifting in tone, confusion replacing confidence as reality began to overlap with expectation. I kept moving, calm, steady, until I reached the outer edge where Linda stood again, clipboard in hand like always. Except this time her posture tightened, her smile hesitated, her eyes tracking something she had not planned for. I stopped a few feet away, not stepping into her space, not raising my voice, just standing there as the scene behind me unfolded exactly as the law allowed it to, the water surface no longer still, no longer controlled, reacting to something far more permanent than any rule she could write. She turned to me, that same practiced tone trying to hold steady, asking what I thought I was doing, and I met her gaze without emotion, without tension, and simply said that I was not doing anything, that I was just allowing access to a water source on agricultural land. And for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she had nothing to say, because everything happening around her was not chaos, it was compliance, and there is no argument you can make against something that is already legal. The shift happened fast, not loud, not chaotic, just a quiet unraveling of something that was never stable to begin with, the kind of change you feel before you fully see it, like pressure in the air before a storm, and I watched it unfold from where I stood, boots planted in dry grass that still belonged to me, while the polished edges of that pool started losing their control, not breaking, not collapsing, just changing purpose in a way nobody there was prepared to understand. The water moved differently now, no longer still and decorative but active, disturbed, part of the land again instead of sitting above it. And the people around it felt that shift immediately, conversations cutting short, laughter fading into uncertain silence as they tried to process what they were seeing, what they were hearing, the low steady presence of something that did not fit into their version of order. Linda stepped closer to me, her heels clicking sharp against the concrete. That clipboard still clutched in her hand, like it could anchor her to authority that was already slipping away. She told me I needed to remove my animals, that this was private property, that I was violating community regulations, and I let her finish, did not interrupt, because when someone leans on the wrong rules, the best thing you can do is let them say it out loud. I reached into the folder and handed her a single page, not the whole stack, just enough, the deed line, the water rights. The agricultural clause highlighted clean and simple, no legal jargon beyond what was necessary, nothing aggressive, just facts printed in black ink that had more weight than anything she could claim. Her eyes moved across the page, fast at first, then slower, the confidence in her posture tightening, shifting, recalculating in real time. And around us the situation continued exactly as it was supposed to, not escalating, not turning into anything dramatic, just continuing. Because nothing happening there violated any law, nothing crossed a line that had not already been defined. Decades before she ever bought into that subdivision, one of the guests asked her what was going on, voice uncertain, trying to hold on to the idea that this was still under control, and Linda opened her mouth to answer but paused, just for a second too long, because there was no clean explanation that did not expose the truth, that this entire structure sat on land she did not own, governed by rules she did not write, and influenced by something she could not regulate. I stepped back slightly, giving her space, not out of respect, but out of clarity. This was not a confrontation anymore. This was a realization. And realizations do not need pressure to happen. They just need time. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the concrete, stretching over water that no longer reflected perfection but reality. And in that moment, everything she had built started to look different, not damaged, not destroyed, just misplaced. And the people around her began to see it too. The hesitation in their movements, the quiet conversations, the subtle shift from confidence to doubt. Because once you understand that something is not yours, it does not matter how much you invested in it. The ground beneath it does not change. I turned and walked back toward the fence line, slow, steady, leaving her there with the papers still in her hand and the situation unfolding exactly as it was meant to, because I had not taken anything from her. I had not forced anything. I had simply let the land operate under the rules it had always followed, and for the first time since this started, she was the one standing on ground she did not understand. By the time I reached the fence line again, the sound behind me had changed completely. No music, no easy laughter, just the low murmur of people trying to make sense of something that no longer fit the story they had been told. And I did not need to turn around and know what it looked like now, because I had already seen that shift before. That moment when control slips quietly out of someone's hands and there is nothing left to grab onto except denial. I leaned against the old wooden post, feeling the rough grain under my palm, and watched the cattle settle near the water, calm, steady, exactly where they were supposed to be. The surface no longer reflecting clean blue perfection, but movement, life, purpose, and somewhere behind me I heard Linda's voice again, sharper this time, trying to pull authority back into place like it was something she could simply reattach. She called for security, called for someone to do something. But the problem with situations like this is that there is no one trained to fix what is legally correct. A man in a polo shirt with a radio clipped to his belt approached the edge, hesitant, unsure, looking from her to the water and back again like he was trying to find a rule that would let him act, and I could almost feel the moment he realized there was none, because nothing happening here broke any law he could enforce. Nothing gave him the authority she was asking for. And that hesitation spread faster than any argument ever could. Guests began gathering their things, towels folding, chairs scraping lightly against concrete, conversations dropping into hushed tones as people stepped away from something that no longer felt exclusive, no longer felt controlled, just uncertain, and uncertainty is not something people pay for. Linda tried again, voice tighter now, saying this was a violation, that she would call the county, call enforcement, call anyone who could shut this down, and I finally turned back toward her, not stepping closer, just enough so she could hear me without raising my voice, and I told her that she should call whoever she believed had authority, because I had already done that part, already checked every line, every clause, every boundary, and there was nothing left for her to challenge that would not collapse under its own weight. The air felt heavier now, not with tension but with realization, the kind that settles slowly and does not leave once it arrives. A few of the residents looked at her differently, not with admiration or trust, but with questions she could not answer, because this was no longer about appearance, it was about foundation, and hers had just been exposed as something she never actually had. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ground in long, uneven lines, and the water, once the centerpiece of her control, now sat there as something entirely different, something she could not restrict, could not manage, could not reclaim without unraveling everything she had built around it. I watched her glance at the paper again, that single page still in her hand, as if reading it twice might somehow change what it said, but words like that do not change. Not when they are backed by time and law and land that does not forget where it belongs. And as more cars began to leave, tires crunching against gravel that had been laid only weeks before, the scale of it became impossible to ignore. This was not a small mistake, not something she could quietly fix or explain away. This was structural, fundamental, something that reached into every decision she had made leading up to this moment. And I pushed myself off the fence, straightened up, and took one last look at the scene before turning away again, not out of disinterest, but because my part in this had already been done. There was nothing left for me to prove, nothing left for me to enforce. The land had already spoken, and all I had done was make sure everyone else could finally hear it. The next morning did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with absence, the kind that settles over a place after something has been quietly undone. And when I drove out past the ridge again, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. No music, no parked cars lining the road, no voices carrying across the pasture, just the wind moving through dry grass and the distant hum of insects, steady and familiar, like the land had already reset itself overnight. I parked at the same spot as before and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots sounding louder without the distraction of people trying to claim space that was never theirs. And when I walked up to the edge, the change was obvious, not dramatic, not destructive, just final. The chairs were gone, stacked or removed entirely, the umbrellas folded, the decorative touches stripped back to something bare and uncertain, and the water, once treated like a centerpiece, now sat there untouched, quiet, not because it had been abandoned, but because no one knew how to use it anymore, not under the reality that had replaced the illusion. I crouched near the edge, ran my hand through the surface, feeling the temperature shift slightly under the morning sun, and for a moment it felt exactly like it always should have, just water, not luxury, not exclusivity, just a resource sitting where it naturally belonged under the rules that governed it. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching, tires slow on gravel, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. Linda stepped out, no clipboard this time, no audience, just her and the weight of everything that had changed. She walked closer, slower than before, her posture different, not weak, not defeated, just measured, like someone recalculating a situation that had moved beyond control. She asked me what I wanted, not with anger, not with authority, but with something closer to understanding that the terms had already shifted. I stood up, brushed the dust from my hands, and told her the truth, simple, direct, that I did not want anything from her, that I had never asked for anything, that all I wanted was what had always been mine, access, recognition, and the space to let the land operate the way it was meant to. She looked out at the water, then back at the surrounding structures, the concrete, the fencing, the pieces of a plan that no longer aligned with reality, And for a moment neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to argue. The facts were not changing, the land was not moving, and no amount of paperwork she could create after the fact would override what had been there long before. She mentioned lawyers, mentioned options, but her voice carried less certainty with each word, because deep down she already understood that this was not a battle she could win by adding more layers. This was something that had to be undone or adapted, and adaptation meant accepting terms she had never intended to face. I nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that the next steps were hers to take, because my part was already complete. The structure existed, the law applied, and the outcome would follow its own path from there. She turned and walked back toward her car, slower than she had arrived, and as the engine started and faded into the distance, the silence returned again, not empty, not uncertain, just settled. I stayed there for a while longer, watching the water, listening to the land, and for the first time since this began, everything felt aligned again, not because something had been taken back by force, but because it had been returned to its proper place without needing to break a single rule. And as I stood up and walked back toward the fence line, the gate still open, the path still clear, I knew one thing for certain: they had built something to control, and all I had done was let it become exactly what it was always meant to be. The county truck showed up 2 days later, not fast, not urgent, just on schedule like everything else that follows proper procedure. White paint dulled by sun, the logo on the door half faded, but still official enough to carry weight where it mattered. And I was already out by the fence line when it rolled in, engine idling low as a man stepped out with a clipboard that looked a lot more worn than the one Linda used to carry. His boots hit the ground with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what your job is and where your authority begins and ends. He nodded once in my direction, not asking questions yet, just observing, taking in the layout, the water, the fencing, the cattle grazing nearby like nothing unusual had ever happened. And in a way, nothing had, not from the land's perspective. He walked the perimeter slow, methodical, checking markers, comparing notes. The faint scratch of pen on paper mixing with the soft sound of wind pushing through grass. And when he reached the edge of the water, he paused, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what was there. A man doing his job without emotion, without assumption. Exactly the kind of presence that ends arguments before they even start. Linda arrived shortly after, her car pulling up quicker than before, door opening with more force than necessary. But even that energy felt different now, less certain, more reactive. She walked toward him already speaking, already explaining, her voice trying to rebuild control through words. But he held up a hand, calm, firm, not dismissive, just final, and asked for documentation, real documentation, not HOA bylaws or internal agreements, but county records, deed lines, permits, water rights, things that do not bend based on preference. I handed over my copies without stepping closer, letting the paper speak for itself the way it always had, and he read through them carefully, not rushing, not skimming, every line carrying the quiet weight of something older than both of us. Linda tried to interject again, pointing to the structures, the investment, the community use, but he did not look up until he finished reading, and when he did, his expression had not changed, which in situations like this means everything has already been decided. He explained it simply, no complicated language, no drawn-out explanation, just facts. The structure was built on agricultural land outside the subdivision boundary. The water source fell under existing livestock access regulations, and any attempt to restrict that access would be a violation, not just of local code but of state agricultural law. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because there was no argument left to make, no angle to pivot toward. Just reality settling in place where illusion used to stand. Linda asked about options, about what could be done, and the answer came just as steady. The structure could remain, but its use had to comply with the land designation. No exclusive access, no restricted entry, no reclassification. Without a full legal process that would likely fail given the existing rights. In other words, everything she built could stay, but it would never function the way she intended. And that is the part that matters most, not loss, not destruction, just transformation into something that no longer serves the purpose it was created for. The inspector finished his notes, handed the papers back to me.